The crystal glass in Min-Seok's hand was worth more than most people earned in a year, and as he raised it to toast his fiancée, Han, the light caught the jagged scars on his knuckles, reminders of the brutal empire he was born to lead. Han smiled, her perfect diamond ring catching the candlelight, a symbol of the pure future his family had demanded. "To us," she whispered, "to the end of old ghosts." Min-Seok began to nod, but the movement died in his throat. A shadow fell over the table. A pair of trembling hands, dark and elegant against the white linen, reached out to refill his wine. Min-Seok's gaze traveled up the arm, past the fraying sleeve of a cheap waitress uniform, and landed on a face that had haunted his every fevered dream for 8 months. It was Amara, the woman his family had threatened to bury if he didn't let her go, the woman he thought had vanished across the world to forget him. But as she leaned in, the table's edge brushed against her stomach. She wasn't just back, she was 7 months pregnant. The silence at the table became a physical weight. As Amara's eyes met his, wide with a mixture of terror and a fierce maternal defiance, Min-Seok felt the world he had built, the alliances, the wedding plans, the Mafia legacy, begin to crumble into ash. He didn't just see his ex-girlfriend. He saw his child, hidden in the belly of a woman working for tips in the very city where his family had sworn she would die. "Would you like more wine, sir?" she asked, her voice a ghost of the melody he used to wake up to. Min-Seok's grip tightened until the crystal groaned. He had 2 choices: stay silent and protect his throne, or speak and start a war that would burn Seoul to the ground. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, and comment where you are watching from. The silence that followed Amara's departure from the table was louder than the clinking of silverware in the crowded restaurant. Min-Seok sat perfectly still, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. Across from him, Han was saying something about the floral arrangements for the engagement gala, her voice a pleasant, melodic hum that felt miles away. He couldn't hear her. All he could hear was the rustle of Amara's cheap polyester uniform, and the heavy, careful step of a woman carrying a weight she was never meant to bear alone. He looked down at his plate. The steak was perfectly seared, expensive, and suddenly looked like ash. 8 months. He began the calculation in his head, a cold mechanical process that he hoped would lead him to a different conclusion. They had been forced apart in late August, on a night when the rain had turned the Seoul skyline into a blur of neon and grief. His father's men had stood in the foyer of their apartment, their presence a silent promise of violence, while he told Amara she had to go. He had been cruel to be kind, hoping that if she hated him, she would run far enough to stay safe. It was now April. The math was relentless. 8 months since that final, shattering night, and she was clearly into her 3rd trimester. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through his shock. Amara standing in their kitchen, laughing as she tried to teach him how to season jollof rice, her skin glowing under the warm yellow lights of the home they were building. He had loved her with a desperation that terrified his family. They had called it a weakness, a smudge on the Han legacy. But looking at her now, seeing the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes as she navigated the crowded dining floor, he realized that the only weakness he had ever possessed was the cowardice to let her leave. "Min-Seok, you haven't touched your wine." Hayen's hand reached across the table, her fingers grazing his sleeve. Her touch was light, elegant, and entirely wrong. "I'm fine," he rasped, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. He took a sip of the wine, but it tasted of iron. He watched Amara through the reflection in the window. She was at a station near the kitchen, leaning heavily against a counter for just a second before a manager barked an order. She straightened immediately, her spine stiffening with that familiar, regal pride he had always admired. She was here. She hadn't left the country. She had stayed in the lion's den, hiding in plain sight, working a double shift while carrying the heir to the very syndicate that wanted her dead. Every instinct he had honed as a leader screamed at him to stand up, to flip the table, to sweep her into his arms and demand to know why she hadn't told him. But the sight of his own bodyguards standing by the door reminded him of the invisible cage they were both in. If he acknowledged her now, in front of Hayen and his father's eyes, he wouldn't be saving her. He would be signing her death warrant. He forced himself to look back at his fiancée, a mask of cold indifference settling over his features. "The lilies," he said, his voice steadying with a new, dangerous resolve. "Use the lilies for the gala. They were always my mother's favorite." He would finish this dinner. He would play the part of the dutiful son for one more hour. But as he watched Amara disappear into the kitchen, Min-Seok knew the engagement ring in his pocket was nothing more than a scrap of metal. The only thing that mattered was the life she was carrying, his life, and the war he was about to start to get them back. Min-Seok didn't go home after the dinner. Instead, he sat in the darkened interior of his black sedan, parked 3 blocks away from the restaurant, watching the service entrance through a haze of rain and cigarette smoke. He had dismissed his primary detail, keeping only Sang-hoon, his most trusted lieutenant, a man who understood that some orders were never to be recorded in the syndicate's ledgers. When the restaurant lights finally dimmed and the staff began to trickle out, Min-Seok's breath hitched. Amara emerged last. She looked smaller without the bustling energy of the dining room to sustain her. She moved with a heavy, swaying gait, one hand pressed firmly against the small of her back as she adjusted a worn cardigan over her uniform. She didn't call a taxi. She didn't look for a car. She simply began to walk, her head down against the biting Seoul wind. "Follow her," Min-Seok commanded, his voice a low vibration in the quiet car. "Slowly, keep the lights off." They shadowed her for 20 minutes, winding through the glittering district of Mappa into a labyrinth of narrow alleys where the neon signs flickered with a tired, dying light. This was a part of the city where the Han family's influence felt less like a crown and more like a predatory shadow. Amara stopped at a crumbling brick walk-up, a building that looked as though it were being held together by nothing but grit and prayer. Min-Seok waited until her silhouette appeared in a 4th-floor window, a dim, yellowish glow that barely penetrated the grime on the glass, before he stepped out of the car. The air smelled of wet pavement and cheap coal briquettes. "Stay here," he told Sang-hoon. The stairwell was narrow and smelled of damp rot. Each step Min-Seok took in his handcrafted Italian leather shoes felt like an intrusion, a loud declaration of the world he represented. When he reached the 4th floor, he didn't knock. He couldn't. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, looking at the door to Unit 402. The wood was splintered around the lock, and a small, charms-filled pouch, something Nigerian, something he remembered her mother gave her for protection, hung crookedly from the handle. Through the thin walls, he heard the sound of a kettle whistling, followed by a soft, rhythmic thumping. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against the cold doorframe. It was the sound of a rocking chair. His mind reeled at the deprivation of it. This was a woman who had once slept on silk sheets, who had been promised a life of luxury, now reduced to hiding in a concrete box to keep his family's hutman at bay. He realized then that she hadn't just stayed in the city. She had gone underground, erased her digital footprint, and chosen poverty as a camouflage. She was living in hiding to stay alive, treated like a fugitive for the crime of carrying his blood. The rocking stopped. "I know you're there, Min-Seok." Her voice came through the door, steady and devoid of surprise. It was a voice that had learned to listen for the footsteps of monsters. "Go away, you've already done enough." Min-Seok closed his eyes, the weight of the 8 months pressing down on him. He didn't answer. He couldn't justify his presence, not yet. He simply stood there in the dark, a silent shadow guarding a door he was no longer allowed to enter, realizing that the safety he thought he had bought her was the greatest lie he had ever told himself. The heavy door of Unit 402 groaned as it opened, not out of welcome, but as a surrender to the inevitable. Min-Seok stepped into the small, dimly lit space, the air smelling of ginger tea and the sharp, metallic tang of an old radiator. Amara stood by a small wooden table, one hand resting protectively over the high curve of her stomach. The harsh overhead light caught the fatigue in her face, but her eyes remained as sharp as shattered glass. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice a low, steady thrum. "The shadows in this hallway have eyes, Min-Seok, your eyes." "I saw you at the restaurant," he replied, his voice barely a whisper as he closed the door behind him. The opulence of his tailored coat felt like an insult in this room where the wallpaper was peeling like sunburnt skin. 8 months, Amara. I spent 8 months believing you were in London, starting over. I sent money to an account that I thought was yours. Amara let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach her eyes. You sent money to a ghost. Your father made sure of that. He wanted you to feel just enough peace to marry the woman he chose, while he ensured I vanished. Min-Seok moved toward her, but stopped when she flinched, a small, instinctive movement that cut deeper than any blade. Why hide like this? In this city? If you had reached out, if you had told me about the child. Told you? Amara interrupted, her voice finally cracking with the weight of her secret. How was I supposed to tell the man whose family held a gun to my world? The night you told me to leave, I didn't just walk away because you asked. I walked away because after you left our apartment, your father stayed behind. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Min-Seok felt a cold numbness spread from his chest to his fingertips. What did he say to you? Amara leaned against the table, her breath hitching. He didn't just offer me a plain ticket, Min-Seok. He showed me a photo of my sister in Lagos. He showed me the route I took to work every morning. And then he told me, with that same polite smile he uses at board meetings, that I would be dead by morning if I didn't leave you. Not just me. He said the complication in my womb wouldn't survive the night either. Min-Seok felt the world tilt. He had spent nearly a year resenting her for leaving so easily, for not fighting for them, while all along she had been fighting a war of survival against his own blood. The protection he thought he had provided by pushing her away had been nothing but a blindfold that allowed his father to move in for the kill. He knew, Min-Seok breathed, the realization shattering his last shred of loyalty to the Han name. He knew about the baby. He knew it was a threat to the succession, Amara said, her hand tightening on her stomach. So I did the only thing I could. I didn't go to London. I stayed where he'd never look, right under his nose, in the dirt and the noise. I traded my life for my daughter's silence. Min-Seok looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the cost of that trade in the hollows of her cheeks and the trembling of her hands. He reached out, and this time he didn't stop until his hand hovered just an inch from the life kicking beneath her skin. It's not a secret anymore, Amara, and it's not just your war. I'm going to end this. Haein Choi was not a woman who missed details. She had been raised in the same cold, high-altitude world as Min-Seok, where a flickering eyelid or a missed beat in a conversation was a tactical error. As she sat in the back of her own chauffeured car the morning after their dinner, she replayed the evening with clinical precision. Min-Seok had always been distant, but last night, his soul had seemingly left the room. He had stared at a simple waitress with a look of such raw, shattered recognition that it had made Haein's own skin crawl with a sudden, sharp insecurity. She adjusted her silk gloves, her eyes reflecting the passing glass towers of Seoul. She did not believe in coincidences, and she certainly did not believe in old ghosts that remained buried. If there was a woman who could make the future head of the Han Syndicate drop a crystal glass, that woman was a threat to the life Haein had spent years securing. Get me the security footage from Sora, Haein said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the car. Her assistant, a man whose primary job was to ensure Haein's path remained unobstructed, didn't hesitate. The restaurant from last night, Miss Choi. The chairman's office might ask why. Then don't let the chairman's office know, she interrupted, her gaze never wavering from the window. I want the names of the staff, specifically the waitresses working the evening shift in the main dining hall, and I want to know where Min-Seok's car went after he dropped me off. By noon, the files sat on her lap. Haein scanned the names, her finger stopping on a face that stood out like a flame in the snow. Amara Akoy. The name was familiar, a ghost from a scandal the Han family had supposedly scrubbed clean 8 months ago. But the photograph from the security feed was what made Haein's breath catch. Amara wasn't just back, she was pregnant. Haein felt a cold, sharp anger bloom in her chest. She wasn't a cruel woman by nature, but she was a pragmatist. A child, a blood heir, changed the mathematics of her marriage. It turned a strategic alliance into a potential battlefield. If Min-Seok's father, the chairman, found out that the complication he thought he had eliminated was still breathing the city air, the fallout would be catastrophic. She looked at the address her investigators had pulled, a crumbling walk-up in a district that didn't even appear on her GPS. Min-Seok's car had been logged idling there for nearly 2 hours. "He's protecting her," Hae-in whispered to the empty car, a bitter smile touching her lips. "He's trying to be a hero in a world that doesn't allow for them." She knew Min-Seok's father would find out eventually. The chairman's network was vast and unforgiving. If she stayed silent, she would be seen as an accomplice to Min-Seok's betrayal. But if she acted too quickly, she might lose her leverage over her future husband. She checked her watch. The clock was no longer just ticking for her wedding. It was counting down the moments until the Han family's cleaners realized the secret was out. Every hour Min-Seok spent playing Guardian was an hour that brought a target closer to Amara's back. Hae-in picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over the chairman's private line. She would give Min-Seok 24 hours to fix this himself. After that, she would ensure her own future was protected, no matter who had to disappear to make it happen. The air in the Han family's ancestral estate was thick with the scent of burning incense and the stifling weight of 5 centuries of tradition. Min-Seok stood in the center of the tea room, his shadow stretching long across the hand-polished floorboards. Seated before him were the elders, his father, Chairman Han, and 2 uncles whose faces were as immobile as the stone statues guarding the estate's gates. To them, the world was a ledger of bloodlines and business mergers. People were merely ink on a page, easily blotted out if they marred the design. "You were seen in Mappo," his father began, his voice a dry rasp that commanded absolute silence. He poured tea with a steady hand, the steam rising like a barrier between them. "And you were seen at a common restaurant, with a woman we already paid to disappear, a woman who is carrying a mistake we did not authorize." Min-Seok felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over him. For years, he had operated within their rules, believing that the brutality of the syndicate was a necessary evil to protect the family. But as he looked at the men before him, men who spoke of his unborn child as an unauthorized mistake, he realized the family he had been protecting was a hollow shell. They didn't value life. They valued the preservation of a myth. "She isn't a mistake," Min-Seok said, his voice quiet but echoing with a power that made his uncles shift in their seats. "And she wasn't paid to disappear. She was hunted by you." His father's eyes narrowed, the teacup pausing halfway to his lips. "We did what was required to ensure the Han name remained untainted. You have a duty to Hae-in, to the syndicate, and to the blood that flows through your veins. This girl, this waitress, is a distraction, a smudge on the legacy. We gave her a chance to run. If she has stayed, she has chosen her own end." "The blood in my veins is the same blood in that distraction," Min-Seok countered, stepping forward into the light. The tattoos beneath his shirt seemed to itch, a map of a life he no longer recognized. "You talk about purity as if it's a virtue, but all I see is rot. You've spent 40 years building an empire of fear, and you're willing to murder your own grandson to keep the walls straight." "Careful, Min-Seok," his uncle warned. "You are speaking to the chairman. You are speaking to the man who made you." "He didn't make me," Min-Seok snapped, his gaze locked on his father's frozen expression. "He trained me, but he forgot to teach me how to be as heartless as he is. You want to know why I went to Mappo? I went to see what it looks like to be brave. Amara has more courage in her little finger, hiding in that slum to protect my child, than all of you have in this palace." Min-Seok reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy signet ring, the gold seal of the Han heir. He placed it on the low table, the metal clicking sharply against the wood. The silence that followed was absolute. "I'm done being the architect of your ghost stories," Min-Seok said, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. "If leading this family means I have to value a name over a life, then I am no longer your leader. I am breaking the line. From this moment on, anyone who moves against her moves against me. And you know better than anyone what I am capable of when I'm protecting what's mine." He turned and walked out, leaving the tea to grow cold and the elders to their silence. For the first time in his life, as he stepped out into the crisp night air, Min-Seok didn't feel like a prince. He felt like a father, and a father was much, much more dangerous. The transition from Mafia prince to rogue protector was a silent, expensive machinery that Min-Seok set in motion before the sun rose. He could not yet bring Amara into his world. It was a burning house, but he could ensure that her world was reinforced with iron and silk. Using a shell company and a series of untraceable intermediaries, he purchased the crumbling apartment building in Mapo. Within 48 hours, the broken hallway lights were replaced with warm, steady LEDs, and the splintered front door was swapped for reinforced steel with a silent, high-tech lock. He moved with the obsession of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. He hired 2 female security specialists, former intelligence officers who could blend into a crowd, to sit in a parked car across from the Sora restaurant, their eyes never leaving the service entrance. He paid Amara's rent 6 months in advance through a community housing grant and arranged for the local grocer to deliver fresh produce and prenatal vitamins to her door, claiming they were part of a neighborhood outreach program. For a week, Min-Seok watched from the tinted darkness of his car, feeling a twisted sense of relief. He was building a fortress around her, brick by invisible brick. But Amara Akoy had not survived 8 months of exile by being oblivious. It happened on a Tuesday evening, under the orange glow of the new streetlights. Min-Seok was leaning against a brick wall in the alleyway behind her apartment, watching her silhouette through the 4th-floor window, when the heavy steel door at the base of the building swung open. Amara didn't head for the bus stop. She walked straight toward the shadows where he stood, her coat unbuttoned despite the chill, her face a mask of cold fury. "You think you're being subtle," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a wire. "But I can smell the hand money from 3 blocks away. The new locks, the free groceries, the 2 women in the gray sedan who follow me to work every morning. Did you think I wouldn't notice my life suddenly turning into a fairy tale written by a ghost?" Min-Seok stepped into the light, his expression tight. "You were living in a ruin, Amara. You were unsafe. I am simply providing what?" "You are playing God," she snapped, stepping into his personal space, her hand coming up to poke a finger against the expensive wool of his lapel. "You're doing exactly what your father does. You're deciding what I need and how I should live without ever asking me. I didn't hide from the Mafia for 8 months just to become a kept woman in a gilded cage you built in the slums." "It's not a cage, it's a shield," Min-Seok insisted, his voice rising with a rare flash of frustration. "My family knows you're here. The clock is ticking. If I don't provide this, I'm leaving you to the wolves." "Then let me face the wolves on my own terms," Amara cried, her eyes shimmering with angry tears. "I would rather be cold and hungry and free than live in a house where the rent is paid in blood money. Every time I see those cameras you installed, I don't feel safe, Min-Seok. I feel watched. I feel like an asset you're protecting for your own conscience." She turned away, her breath hitching in the cold air. "If you want to be in my life, you show up as a man, not as a provider, not as a boss. Stop trying to control the world around me and just stand next to me. Otherwise, take your grants and your guards and get out of my sight." She walked back into the building, the heavy steel door slamming shut with a final, echoing boom. Min-Seok stood alone in the alley, the signet ring gone from his finger, realizing that while he had destroyed his relationship with his father, he was still using his father's tools. He had offered her an empire, but all she wanted was the truth. The Cold War between Min-Seok and his father finally drew blood on a Thursday night when the rain turned into a stinging sleet. Min-Seok was blocks away, caught in a heated debate with Sang-hoon about moving Amara to a safe house, when his phone buzzed with a frantic, silent alert from the new security system he'd installed. The camera feed from the 4th-floor hallway showed a man in a delivery uniform standing outside Unit 402. But the man wasn't carrying a parcel. He was wearing surgical gloves and holding a canister of odorless sedative gas. Min-Seok didn't wait for the car to stop. He rolled out of the moving vehicle as it skidded into the alleyway, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He knew that man. It was the Weaver, a specialist his father used only when a situation needed to be erased without a trace. The Weaver didn't leave bodies. He made people vanish into the Han family's private crematoriums. He took the stairs 3 at a time, the lack of oxygen burning in his lungs. When he reached the 4th floor, the hallway was eerily silent. The steel door to Amara's apartment was slightly ajar, the high-tech lock hissed open by an expert hand. Min-Seok kicked the door wide, his vision tunneling into a red haze. Inside, the small living room was a wreckage of broken dreams. The rocking chair was overturned. Amara was backed into the corner of the kitchen, her face pale with terror, clutching a heavy cast-iron skillet as her only defense. The weaver was moving toward her with the practiced, predatory grace of a man who had done this 100 times, a syringe glinting in the low light. "Step away from her," Min-Seok rasped, his voice a guttural snarl that didn't sound human. The weaver turned, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if interrupted during a routine chore. "Young master," the chairman was very clear, "you are too close to this asset to make a rational decision. I am simply fulfilling the family's wishes." "I am the family," Min-Seok said, stepping into the room. The weaver lunged, a blade appearing in his hand with a flick of his wrist. Min-Seok didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the legacy of violence his father had spent 30 years carving into him. He caught the assassin's wrist, the sound of snapping bone echoing in the small apartment. The weaver gasped, but he was a professional. He drove a knee into Min-Seok's ribs, sending him crashing against the radiator. Amara screamed as the assassin recovered, turning his blade toward her to finish the job before Min-Seok could rise. In that split second, the last tether of Min-Seok's restraint snapped. He grabbed a heavy glass award from the bookshelf, a trophy he had won for loyalty to the syndicate years ago, and brought it down with shattering force. The weaver crumpled to the floor, the surgical gloves staining red. Min-Seok stood over him, chest heaving, the jagged remains of the award still in his hand. He looked down at the blood on his knuckles, hand blood, spilled by a hand weapon. The line wasn't just broken, it was severed. He turned to Amara, who was shaking violently, her hands still gripped around the skillet. He didn't try to touch her. He stayed where he was, a blood-stained monster in her sanctuary, letting her see the truth of what he had become to keep her alive. "He won't stop," Amara whispered, her eyes wide as she looked from the body on the floor to the man she once loved. "Your father, he'll send more." "Let him," Min-Seok said, his voice cold and final. He picked up the assassin's dropped phone and dialed his father's private line. When the chairman answered, Min-Seok didn't wait for him to speak. "I just sent your weaver back to you in pieces. If you send another, I won't just break the bloodline, father. I'll burn the house down with you inside it." The violence of the night had left a lingering, metallic chill in the room, but it was the sudden, sharp intake of Amara's breath that truly froze the marrow in Min-Seok's bones. She slumped against the kitchen counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the sink. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain that had nothing to do with the assassin lying unconscious on the floor. "Amara!" Min-Seok was at her side in an instant, his bloody hands hovering, afraid to touch her, afraid to stain her further. "Too early," she gasped, her voice strained and thin. "Min-Seok, it's too early, the stress. I think it's happening." The drive to the hospital was a blur of high-speed turns and red lights that Sang-hoon ignored with grim determination. In the backseat, Min-Seok held Amara, his expensive wool coat bundled under her as she moved through waves of premature labor. She clung to his hand with a strength that surprised him, her fingernails digging into his palm, grounding them both in a shared agony. He didn't speak of the syndicate or the chairman. He only whispered her name, over and over, a litany of desperate hope. The sterile white halls of the university hospital felt like a different planet. Min-Seok paced the private waiting wing he had cleared with a single phone call and a bag of cash, his presence a dark blot against the clinical perfection of the ward. He was still covered in the weaver's blood, a grim reminder of the world he was trying to burn down. Hours bled into a singular, agonizing point of time until a nurse emerged, her expression weary but soft. "She's stable. The baby is small, but she's a fighter. You can come in now." Amara looked ethereal in the harsh hospital light, her dark skin pale with exhaustion, cradling a tiny, swaddled bundle against her chest. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the monitors. As Min-Seok approached, he felt a terrifying, fragile peace. This was the complication his father wanted to erase, a perfect, breathing girl with Amara's defiant eyes. An administrator entered quietly, clutching a clipboard and looking nervously at Min-Seok's disheveled appearance. "Sir, we need the information for the birth certificate. The mother has provided her details, but for the father." Amara looked up at him, her gaze searching. This was the final threshold. To put his name on that paper was to hand his father a roadmap to his heart. It was a formal declaration that this child was a Han, an heir, and a target. It was the end of his life as a shadow and the beginning of his life as a marked man. He reached for the pen. His hand didn't shake. "Min-Seok Han," he said clearly, the words feeling like the first honest things he had said in a decade. He signed the document with the same hand that had broken an assassin's wrist hours before. By claiming her, he was officially declaring war on the Han dynasty. He wasn't just signing a birth certificate, he was signing a manifesto. He looked at Amara, who reached out and covered his hand with hers, her touch no longer a flinch, but a seal of their new, dangerous alliance. The Empire could come for them, the elders could scream about purity, and the cleaners could fill the streets. But as he looked down at his daughter, Min-Seok knew he had finally found something worth the fire. The morning light that filtered through the windows of the new apartment was different from the cold, clinical glare of the Han estate. It was soft, gold, and carried the quiet hum of a city waking up without the permission of a syndicate. In the center of the nursery, a room filled with the scent of lavender and the rhythmic, soft puff of a sleeping infant's breath, Min-Seok sat in the very rocking chair he had once watched from a dark hallway. He looked down at his daughter, Nia. She was tiny, a miracle of resilience who had survived the storms of his family's making. Her small hand was curled around his index finger, her grip surprisingly firm. It was a weight far heavier than the signet ring he had discarded, yet it didn't feel like a burden. For the first time in his life, his hands weren't clenched into fists or wrapped around a weapon. They were simply holding something precious. Amara sat beside him, her shoulder resting against his. The exhaustion was still there, etched in the faint shadows under her eyes, but the terror that had defined her life for 8 months had finally begun to dissolve. She watched him with a steady, quiet grace, no longer looking for the monster in his shadow. "The chairman called again this morning," Min-Seok said, his voice a low whisper that barely stirred the air. "He offered a truce, a seat at the table if I bring the child to the estate for a blessing." Amara's hand tightened on his, her body tensing instinctively. Min-Seok turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "I told him the chairman no longer has a son, and he certainly doesn't have a granddaughter. I told him if any of his people step within a mile of this building, I won't send them back at all." He leaned his head back against the chair, closing his eyes. The world outside was still dangerous. His father's pride was a wounded animal, and Hayen's silence was a tactical choice that would eventually expire. He was no longer the untouchable heir to an empire. He was a man with a target on his back and a family to shield. He had traded absolute power for a precarious, beautiful peace. "You're not the boss anymore," Amara murmured, her thumb tracing the jagged scars on his knuckles. "No," Min-Seok replied, looking down at Nia and then back to Amara. "I'm something much harder to be. I'm yours." He realized then that his path wasn't about the empire he had left behind, but the one he was building here, in the quiet of a nursery. He wasn't just a protector by trade or by blood. He was a protector by choice. He had spent his life being a king of shadows, ruling over a world built on the fear of others. Now, he was a father, finding his strength in the trust of the woman beside him and the breath of the child in his arms. As Nia stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft, contented sigh, Min-Seok reached out and took Amara's hand, lacing their fingers together. The war wasn't over. Perhaps it would never truly be over. But as the sun rose over Seoul, he knew he was finally standing on the right side of the fire. He was no longer running from the ghost of who he was. He was finally becoming the man they needed him to be.